After a few days in Juneau, enjoying the sunning seals and delicious crab, it was time for one more last flight north. Flying in Alaska is wild. It's not just the distances. It's also not just the vast wilderness streaming below at 550 miles per hour. After all, there are a lot of flight routes between major cities that fly over Siberia, northern Canada, or, of course, any ocean. What makes flying in Alaska so interesting is that nestled in amongst the mountains, prairies, boreal forests, and fjords are these small, isolated communities. No bigger than towns, really, but with an airport big enough to handle a 747. It's wild. Eventually, after 2 stops at these tiny airports, we arrived in Anchorage. This is, unquestionably, a city. Over half the population of this massive state lives here. Like everything in Alaska, it's also wildly spread out. City limits comprise more land area than the entire state of Rhode Island. The airport is one of the busiest in the world for cargo. It's almost exactly halfway between Eastern Asia and the east coast of the US, and it's only slightly farther to the northwest of Europe, though that route is less important now with longer-range aircraft and, usually, being able to access the airspace over Siberia. Anchorage is the gateway to much of Alaska, not just for tourists, but also a variety of businesses, most notably oil. We rented a rather beefy SUV, not just so we could blend in, but also because we knew what kind of roads were coming. First, though, we set out for Seward. It's about 2.5 hours south of Anchorage. The drive, along the Turnagain Arm Inlet and weaving its way through the Kenai Mountains, was impressively scenic. But I knew this would just be a taste for what's to come. We spent a few days in Seward, checking out the Exit Glacier, the only part of the Kenai Fords National Park accessible by road. And as impressive as this was, it wasn't even our main destination up here. We set out for that destination, but first we retraced our steps to Anchorage, as there was just too much ground to cover. The nearby Independence Mine State Historical Park wasn't quite open yet, but the road had been plowed and the park ranger gave us basically a, "well, I'm not stopping you," shrug. So we walked up the steep road. The mine started in 1897 and was abandoned in 1950. The buildings are surprisingly well preserved. At first, Dad and I thought the 10-foot deep snow was a hindrance, but then we realized it only added to the hauntingly beautiful, abandoned vibe of the place. The next day we set out again, this time east. This would be the most grueling drive of my trip. First, it was up along the Matanuska Valley, then briefly along the Copper River, then a sharp left onto McCarthy Road. McCarthy Road started bad and then got continually worse. Following the rail bed of the old Copper River and Northwestern Rail line, it's largely unpassable most of the year. We were lucky. There hadn't been much rain recently, so it was just vicious, rutted gravel and not viscous, car-swallowing mud. While 7 hours to cover 257 miles doesn't seem too bad, that's a bit misleading. It took less than 4 hours to cover the first 200 or so miles, and then 3 more to cover the last 60. So I guess in fairness, an average of 20 miles an hour isn't much worse than what you'd get in LA during any given rush hour. Somewhere along the way, we passed into Wrangell St. Elias National Park and Preserve, the largest national park in the US. It covers some 20,587 miles, which is 53,320 square, what's this say? Kilometers? That can't be right. That makes the park roughly the size of Croatia. It's 6 times larger than Yellowstone. 9 of the 16 tallest mountains in the United States are here, including the second highest, Mount St. Elias. It's also one of the least visited national parks. Where Yellowstone gets around 5 million visitors a year, Wrangell St. Elias gets 50,000. I guess that's not too surprising given how difficult it is to get here. The main town, if you could call it that, is McCarthy itself. It's a couple of dirt rows roughly connecting a handful of well-worn wooden buildings. It's home to an eclectic mix of a few dozen hardy, shall we say, independent-minded folk, and also some off-the-grid hippie types. You'll see homesteader gardens as often as openly carried firearms. Though given that the locals are well outnumbered by the bears, the latter probably seems logical. There's a private bridge crossing the rushing gray glacier runoff, but if you don't live here, it's exceptionally expensive to cross. So instead, there's a parking lot and a free footbridge. On the other side, we got picked up by the van owned by our hotel, the Kennecott Glacier Lodge. It was built adjacent to the abandoned Kennecott Copper Mine, our final destination, Free, included with the price, are awe-inspiring views of the glacier itself. The Kennecott Copper Mine was first established in 1900 and then grew steadily over the next 20 years. That's all the more impressive when you consider it's located in one of the least accessible places in the world. As you probably guessed, that's because the copper found here was some of the best ever discovered. By the time the mine closed in 1938, it had pulled around $6 billion out of the ground, and that's in today's money. The building you see here, called a concentration mill, is almost entirely made of wood. Aerial gondolas brought the ore down from the mine some 3,500 feet higher up the mountain, ending at the top of the building. From there, a series of crushers and shakers would separate the valuable ore from the worthless limestone. Eventually, the ore alone would arrive at the bottom, where it was loaded on train cars and brought all the way out to the ocean. Loaded on barges, it would make the long trek down to smelters located in and around Seattle. Where did those smelters get their electricity? Eventually, from the Grand Coulee Dam you saw in episode 4. The mine was pretty much abandoned by the time the dam got up and running, so there was unlikely any overlap, but I thought this connection was pretty interesting. I wrote a whole article about the Kennecott Copper Mine, along with the tour my dad and I did. I'll leave a link in the description below. The next day we went for a hike to see the Root Glacier where it connects to the Kennecott Glacier. Distances are deceptive here. The mountains are further away and far larger than they seem. The glaciers themselves seem close and river-sized, but they're not. Even after several days here, it was impossible to say if a stream in the distance was a trickle or a torrent. If a moraine peak was the size of a boulder or the size of an apartment building. It was humbling, like an earthbound version of when you look up at the night sky and realize that some of those stars are actually galaxies and everything is just so much bigger than it once seemed. Thanks for watching.